why it was important, why it is important to this day. If you think back to the pre-internet era, when the internet was there, but not everybody used it, not everybody had a laptop computer used on a daily basis. And you think about the news media, what you can think of is a sector which was largely the print media, owned by a small number of oligopolists, whether it was Murdoch or otherwise. And these publishers decided the acceptable range of debate that was allowed on a range of topics, whether it's war, whether it's economics, whether it's politics. And it was to these publishers and into their publishing houses that whistleblowers were providing information. Now, these whistleblowers were engaging with individual journalists, some of whom understood the gravity of some of these national security leaks, others who dumped them in to the security services. So WikiLeaks entered and revolutionized journalism by allowing the information age to enter into the journalistic sphere, and by allowing whistleblowers to maintain not just the privacy of their identity when contacting journalists, but also the security of the documentation, to ensure that to this day, unlike any other newspaper you can think of, WikiLeaks has a 100% track record of accuracy. And that's because the way in which WikiLeaks was modeled was that the information was not just received by a small amount of people and, the smear is it was dumped on the internet. But it was actually a group of very specialized people who were able to harness technology, but also experts like Andy Worthington, whom you saw on the screen, who's the Guantanamo expert, a journalist who understood who the men were who were being rendited to Guantanamo, and those of you who are aware of what happened and what's happening to this day at Guantanamo, where 789 Muslim men have been tortured, would want to know from experts like those to ensure that the documentation that you're receiving in the leak was accurate. But also, not only providing the information to the big New York Times or the Guardians or the Washington Posts of this world, but to local newspapers, for example, in Tunisia, where it helped spark the Arab Spring, for example, in relation to Kenya, where corruption was discovered in Daniel Arap Moi's government, whether it was information related to Trafigura's toxic dumping off the Ivory Coast. This was the kind of information that was being leaked via WikiLeaks to journalists. And it was going to journalists like the New York Times, who could spread the information around the world, but who only had a very small and finite attention span and only a few inches of column space, as well as journalists who could, like Stefania Maurizi, whom you will hear from next, who could go into the detail and really understand the realities of what was going on. So it created a new and revolutionary form of information-led journalism that was also very democratic, because it allowed for the historic archival of the whistleblown information, which meant that you didn't have to rely on the integrity of a small number of journalists to have the information. You could receive the information as a member of the public democratically to understand it, and then to put it in the context of, for example, a freedom of information request or information that you might have received through declassified documentations 50 years later. And we're seeing this even now in relation to whether there was a promise to Russia in relation to NATO expansion, or these kinds of questions were being discussed in various fora in the past, and we can see how this declassified information is being used in other scenarios to this day. But also WikiLeaks information is being used to give information, for example, about a gentleman by the name of Khaled El-Masri. Mr. El-Masri is a German citizen, that is an EU citizen, who was abducted on the Macedonian border, rendited, taken to Afghanistan, tortured, at which point the CIA realized it was a case of mistaken identity. He was sodomized, he was just beaten up brutally, and even when the CIA realized it was a case of mistaken identity, they did nothing about it. They had some internal political wrangling as to who would take the blame. Mr. al-Masri was then dumped on the Albanian border, where he, in the middle of the night, where he thought he was going to be shot in the back of his head. He made his way back to Germany because the Albanian police picked him up and sent him back to Germany, at which point nobody believed his story. And that is because he had no way of proving that this had happened to him. And the German government was put under pressure by the United States to not acknowledge what had happened to Mr. al-Masri and to not prosecute the 8 CIA agents who were involved in that rendition. And the horror that Mr. al-Masri suffered received only a modicum of justice because of WikiLeaks releases, which were brought to the European Court of Human Rights, at which point Mr. al-Masri was given some credibility for his story. Now, it isn't just that we shouldn't torture innocent men like Mr. al-Masri, but we shouldn't torture anyone. There is a prohibition against torture. It doesn't matter. You don't have to demonstrate your worth not to be tortured. And this is what we know from the Guantanamo Bay detaining assessment briefs, where we know people were waterboarded, where, 70, 80, 90 times. People were sexually assaulted, people were really horrendously treated, where they were told members of their family would be killed, or where members of their family would be sexually assaulted in the next room. These kinds of treatments were given to men as young as 14 and 15. And to this day, 40 detainees remain at Guantanamo, 20 of whom have been authorized for release but who are not being released. And it is for this reason that what Julian and WikiLeaks did was revolutionary and important. It was also important because for the first time we had a journalistic organization that had the courage to say, once I've released this information, when the United States government puts pressure on me to retract the information, I won't retract it unless it's untrue. And that's what made WikiLeaks different and special. And it's really, really important that we recognize that it is this courage that needs to be contagious. You are students, you are going to change the world. And it is important that you take this kind of courage into the world, to the professions you are going to go into. And so it is my privilege now to introduce Stefania Maurizi, who's going to tell you a little bit about the WikiLeaks releases at that time, and then